Hello, everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to another part of our interview series. Firstly, I do just want to briefly address my voice. I have been sick the last couple of days, so if you notice that my voice sounds off, that's why. But that is not the focus of this conversation. Today, we are going to be talking with Shakti Bliss Bunny, who I've actually referenced before. If you guys have seen the video I did talking about Ropecraft Chicago, and she has very graciously offered her time to have a conversation with us today about connection and mindfulness in kink. So, Shakti, for those of us who are listening that might not be aware of who you are and what your background is, would you mind sharing a little bit of that first?
Yeah, of course. Hi, it's really awesome to be here and get to chat with you. I've super admired your work and how you present yourself to our community. So I'm excited to be here and have this conversation with you. So for those who might not be as familiar with me, I'm Shakti Bliss or Shakti Bliss Bunny, and I am a yoga teacher, super witchy doula out of Austin, Texas. And what that really means is that I like to somatically and emotionally work with people's bodies and with mindfulness in general. And I've just decided to take a lot of those skills that I've built and personal resources that I use in my life and share them in the kink and BDSM world, specifically the rope world, to help us engage in more intentional and mindful interactions with one another.
So, how long have you been in the kink community for? Was it something where you got into kink first and the rest of it followed, or was this already part of your life journey? And then when you started in kink, you started seeing those connections?
I had been kinky for a little while, but I hadn't really been out in the community. I didn't really know what that meant or how to really engage with that meaningfully until I was introduced to rope. And rope was sort of like the gateway for me to be introduced to just being able to engage with other people in a community setting and actually seek formal education around kink and BDSM. And that was about 3.5 to 4 years ago. So seems like a while. I still consider myself incredibly new, especially in comparison to a lot of those who I've learned from over the years and been grateful to be friends with. But a lot of my perspective actually just comes from outside of the kink world, but it's been super enjoyable for me to find the intersections with kink and BDSM and other areas of my life, especially, referring to how we digest emotion, trauma, and enjoyment through experiences and sensations in the body.
One of the first things I think when we start this conversation, we should probably outline is when we're talking about connection and mindfulness, what does that actually mean?
First of all, for me, personally, mindfulness and connection refers to the self. I know that it's super easy to on default think of actions that we can do to be mindful. But to me, it really means starting with grounding yourself, which is really identifying where we are in our process, where we are emotionally, identifying the differences between our feelings and emotions and reality and what's actually happening around us, because it's very easy to intertwine and link those two experiences together. And really just understanding not only the marriage, but the separation between the body, the mind, and overall feeling.
What would you say is the main connection between mindfulness and connection and kink? Is it something where it's about connecting to yourself first before you give that to other people, or is it, I guess maybe another way of thinking about this, is it more of an intrapersonal thing or an interpersonal thing?
I think it's both in a strategic way. And that's sort of what I like to teach in my classes, is that it is getting in touch with the self, and really the ultimate lesson of the journey of getting in touch with the self ultimately leads you to get in touch with other people and understand others better. The closer that we are and the better the relationship that we have with ourselves, the better we can connect authentically with other people.
Okay. And if you were somebody who is new in the community, let's say you found out about FetLife last week, you want to go to your first munch, you want to go to your first play party, or you want to try rope, something along those lines, and you want to make sure you're kind of getting off on the right foot mentally, emotionally, physically, how would you recommend starting to cultivate that kind of mindfulness and connection?
I like to ask a lot of people, like, if they already have any type of mindfulness practice. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean, like, do you do yoga or do you meditate? It's really any point in the day where we allow ourselves to, like, quiet the outside and get in touch with ourselves. And for some people, that's running. For some people, it's walking their dog. For some people, it's like, a certain ritual that they have throughout the day. And I just like to ask people what their relationship with themselves and with mindfulness is. But really, I think that going and engaging in activities, learning, being with your community is hugely important. But just understanding how sensitive this type of engagement is that we like to explore in this world, that we are really diving deep pretty quickly with experiencing certain fragile emotions that for a lot of us can be centered around past trauma. And that's ultimately what's super freeing about the engagements that we have, is that we can learn to build a safe space. And I always say safe space with quotation marks, right? Like, we learn to build a place where we feel somewhat safe to explore things that might have been traumatic for us in earlier parts of our life, that might be something that we have had previously an unhealthy relationship with, but we want to form a healthy somatic relationship with these feelings. I just really think that understanding the importance of how we are engaging and understanding, like, how sensitive it is to really do something like have impact play. The reality of impact play is that you're hitting someone, and, understanding, like, the cultural aspects around hitting people, and understanding, like, the emotional perspectives that aren't even your own around this act, and really just becoming friends is what I think of it as, is like becoming friends with this activity and understanding, how it can impact another person before we go directly into the act. And that, all of the things that we do in kink are fun, like impact play, rope, all of the things that we engage in are super fun, but understanding that they're also an extension of our touch, and that we are essentially touching people in other ways, and really what that means and how we have the power of impacting ourselves and others.
You sort of mean, like, let's say, for example, you're going out somewhere and you want to engage in CHplay. I think this is a really common one that people bring up. And you might have one relationship with CHplay, and you kind of have to recognize that through you doing it, you're also impacting the energy of that space. You're impacting the other people around you, and kind of just learning exactly what your connection is to play before you engage in it. And then also acknowledging that, like, you don't exist in a bubble when you're in a public play space. Does that sound right?
Yes, you don't exist in a bubble. And also just how you're affecting your partner. Are you engaging with other people? What is their role in your eyes? Are we having a conversation where we're actually taking the time to build that space together, where we understand where we both exist and how we're both engaging with one another? And yes, how you impact the public space in general, the public energy of this space, and other perspectives of your play that might not be your own, and how comfortable you are with that.
Yeah. So is it something where, in your opinion, let's say somebody does have a negative reaction to a scene that you do or a type of play that you engage in, is it the person's responsibility who has the reaction to kind of temper that within themselves? Or is it something where the person engaging in the play needs to acknowledge ahead of time that they might need to be available to work through things with people? Or is a little bit of both depending on the situation?
I think that it heavily depends on the situation, but this is also like a perspective of mine that people don't like very often, and that they don't like to hear. But ultimately, I feel like it is our personal responsibility to understand what keeps us safe, and that it's really not the world. If we expect the world outside to bend and mold itself to our triggers, we're going to be disappointed every single time, because it would ultimately be impossible for people to do that all the time with every person who shares space. And so that's why a lot of the times when I say safe space, and I use it in quotations, I'm just someone who, once again, from my own experience as, like, a marginalized person in this community, like, safe spaces don't really exist for me. Like, I have to go into every space prepared to harness my own emotions and prepared to take care of myself, whether that means leaving the space, whether that means asking someone to have a conversation with me, whether that means, engaging in my own rituals and practices, that it's really my responsibility to try to keep myself safe to the utmost ability that I have. And that doesn't always mean that I'm going to be safe. And it doesn't always mean that I'm going to be able to avoid someone who might be a predator. At the end of the day, I need to hold other people accountable as well as holding myself accountable. But really, like, other people playing around me and possibly triggering me it's not really their responsibility to adjust their play based on me. If it's somebody in a space that honors my space in that way and that they would like to, then that's a personal conversation we can have. And I don't think someone is wrong for asking people to do so, but that's not something that I would regularly engage in, because I just have never existed in a space where I expect others to shift and change based on my comfort. It's not something that has ever really happened in my life, inside or outside of kink, and not something that I regularly expect. But I also do know how to regulate myself, and I do know what I need at certain moments. And if I don't, then I also know what to rely on to help like ground myself and keep myself safe in the moment.
Yeah, and I think this is a conversation that we've had a lot in my local community because, we are in a very fortunate situation where we do have options of play parties, where we do have a pets and a littles night. We have an edge play night. We have different nights that are specifically for rope. We have a general new person party. And so I think there is already a little bit of segmentation that can be available if you know that you cannot be around age players. You cannot be around blood. You cannot be around heavy impact player or whatever else. You kind of have opportunities to make sure that you are going to the events that will work within the boundaries that you have, and the things that you know you are comfortable with are going to be there, and the things that you know you're not are as separate as they can be to start out with. And then acknowledging that, like, if it's not your dungeon, you don't get to make the rules about like what is and isn't allowed there. And I think it is important to realize, your kink is not my kink, but that's still okay, right? Where just because you don't enjoy seeing a particular type of play, or you don't enjoy hearing a particular thing, that doesn't make it wrong or bad that other people choose to engage with that. And I think it's something that we could all keep in mind a little bit more than maybe we do already. I think there is a little bit of an expectation that, like, oh, you shouldn't do that kind of play in public. You should know better, even if it's not like against the space's rules to engage in that,
It's a lot of just, coming from a place of people trying to keep themselves safe, but not necessarily having tools to do so. And I think that when people walk into a space and expect things to be adjusted based on their comfort, it's not coming from any type of, good or bad place. I just think it is reaching for tools that maybe they don't have available to them. And that's ultimately my goal of like teaching the classes that I do, and even like launching the Patreon that I'm launching, is just being able to provide extra tools for people so that they feel like they have some sort of resources. And I do think that's part of the journey, right? Is like what you said before, of just like exploring what makes me feel safe, what doesn't make me feel safe. Do I like engaging in this type of play? Do I not like engaging in this type of play? Can I be around this other type of play? And that is a huge like exploratory journey that is constant and ongoing, and it shifts and changes based on the day and how you might be feeling and the certain events that have been going on in your life. And so I think that just remembering that we all have to like stay teachable, and remembering that things are going to ebb and flow based on how you feel, and that feelings are not facts, and they're inconsistent and they come in waves, and just understanding ourselves to that extent and extending that compassion to ourselves around our experience can also lead us to doing that with others, which makes a closer, more mindful and intentional community in general.
So it's about kind of recognizing where you're at first before sort of projecting that onto other people. And I think there's actually a somewhat interesting analogy to being in polyamory and being in open relationships in terms of dealing with jealousy. This is actually a conversation I've had somewhat recently with my partner, so it's a little bit timely. I think sometimes people who navigate into open relationships by whatever way they happen to find it, when they come up with an issue, when they're dealing with hurtful feelings, negative feelings, they try and put up boundaries to attempt to stop that. But by doing that, they usually are also trying to limit other people's behavior. So things like, I don't want you to kiss this person in front of me. I don't want you to text this person when we're together. Like whatever boundaries they think will help them deal with their jealousy, rather than looking internally and examining why those feelings exist, and kind of working through that rather than placing up walls to try and prevent that feeling from ever happening in the first place. And I think, depending on what you negotiate, it's all about what you negotiate for. So there are people who have relationships where those kinds of walls and boundaries are okay, but you got to talk about it first before you just assume you can do that with other people in your life and that they will uphold the boundaries that you need in order to have you feel comfortable, and taking that time to feel like it's okay to like work on yourself and examine your feelings and figure out if there's things that not only the outside world could change, but that also you could change as well. So that way you have a better relationship with the people in your life. You have a better relationship with your emotions, and just more positivity in general, I guess, moving forward is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's another thing that I'm really just super passionate about, is talking to people about, their feelings around poly and helping them process, and not coming from a place of that I like know everything, because I definitely don't. I've been practicing polyamory, I would say, for maybe a year or two more than I've been in the kink world. I do think that just taking the time and space to sit down, reflect, and honestly, it's reprogramming. It's reprogramming how we've been conditioned to understand our feelings. And there was a way that my mother used to explain it that I think about it all the time, in terms of like, when you have trauma, or when you have a bad feeling against something and you're not processing it, it like just lives in your body, and it's almost like this thorn that sticks out of your skin. And if you're navigating the world, walking around and expecting people to avoid your thorns because it stings you, you're going to be constantly disappointed, and you're going to have to build a world around these people avoiding hurting you. And that's very difficult to do, but it's really our own process and our own work to understand why those thorns are there, how they exist, and work them out of our system and work them out of our body. And so it is very much the same when we're talking about the safety within relationships, and how we perceive that safety emotionally, and how we start to dive into our own feelings and ask ourselves why they're there, and really just starting to deprogram what we consider as threats, and understanding fear, and becoming friends with our fear, and learning to walk hand in hand with it, and understanding, how we can interpret love and how we digest love through our system as well. So I do think it's the same in terms of, like you said, like building up these walls to try to keep yourself safe. And what I've learned as someone who built a lot of walls in my life is that eventually you're going to realize those walls keep the things out that you really want and that you desire. And when we're really all looking for connection, we're looking to be understood. We're all looking for people to see us for who we truly are. And no one can see us through, 10 feet of brick and mortar around us.
One question that comes to mind is, how do you learn the difference between a healthy boundary versus a negative wall that's keeping people out? So, for example, maybe the difference between, say, a situation where you're like, hey, before we engage in play, I need to establish safe word and aftercare usage with you ahead of time, and I won't play unless we've done that, versus, say, I'm having trouble thinking of an exact example here, but something that would be a negative wall, a negative blockage to connection, versus something that's a healthy boundary.
I think that's really hard, because honestly, they're the exact same thing. I think that it's like, asking what removes a nail and what hammers a nail into a wall. And it's like, it's the exact same tool. It just depends on how you use it. And I think that, boundaries are super healthy. I'm getting to a place in my personal journey where I'm starting to realize that like how necessary certain boundaries are in my life based on my own self-control. So that's just a whole other side conversation. But I do think that boundaries and these walls, they're all the same stuff. Boundaries are something that we have to set with certain people who we're not sure are going to climb over that wall or not, and whether we invite them in or not. And so I think that, and many people can possibly relate to this that are listening, that maybe have like long-term kink or play relationships with people who they found this deep trust and intention with as they play together, and they realize that their boundaries are a little more loose, they're a little more fluid, and it's not as a result of them being being irresponsible. It's a result of like this foundational friendship and comfort and understanding, that knowing that although the boundaries may ebb and flow, that this person overall respects them, and there's some sort of line that gets crossed in a healthy way where they just build a cultivating environment. But with someone new, you might find that the boundaries are a little bit more stern, and that you need to like outline them in a healthier way. So I think that honestly, a wall most of the time started as a healthy boundary that maybe stayed too long, or it's a healthy boundary that's around more than it really needs to be around. A healthy boundary that hasn't been revisited in quite a while, that's past its expiration date. After a while, it starts to become that hard wall that we are just so used to being there, and we don't realize is just keeping people out. And so that's really the necessity of checking in with ourselves and continuing on the journey. And that is like a huge one of the brands that I do with my partner around polyamory is called Love Wild Awake. And that's really where that name came from, is that like it's so tempting to fall asleep in our processes. It's so tempting to just like to just lean into the comfort of staying in one place and just be like getting really tired of doing the internal work and like just taking a rest. It is super tempting, but like staying awake and processing continually and be willing to lean into the discomfort and just continually moving forward in your own process is just staying awake. And it's not always sunshine and rainbows. It's pain, and it's the entire emotional spectrum, and it's the entire journey. But to me, that's really like the supple yumminess of like life, is really diving into all of that stuff and realizing that it's not so much about right or wrong or positive or negative or how is it's really just about experiencing and understanding how we can learn and shift and like remold based on these experiences, and also knowing that it's forever changing.
And one of the things that brings to mind for me is, I think sometimes in kink, especially when it comes to long-term partnerships, it can get stagnant very easily, because let's say you negotiate with your partner, okay, we sat down for a whole weekend and we came up with this amazing contract and we both love it and it has all these amazing rules in it, or just even a negotiation with a play partner as well could be similar, and then you sit on that and you don't change it, and it stays in the place you were a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and you're not revisiting where all of those things now are in your current life. I think you have to think about things as growing alongside you, as opposed to being tools that are stagnant in time and never changing. And for some people that can work because they are slower growers, or they're maybe already very well developed in who they are and where they are in life. But for most of us, especially those of us who are newer along in our kink journey, who are really still discovering what our interests are and what we want out of all of this, keeping things the way that they were a very long time ago is not necessarily how you establish a healthy, long-term, ongoing connection with somebody. You need to have that ability to reflect back on decisions you've made before, and boundaries you've put up and things you've agreed on, and say, hey, are we still on the same page about this? Is this kind of both what we're still wanting? And if it's not, how do we change that? And if it is, great. All right, we'll just keep going with that,
Yeah, exactly. And just understanding that we're all transforming all the time, and transformation is conversational. And so you have to have the ability to have these conversations, and whether they're comfortable or not. And you have to be willing to be, which requires you to be vulnerable. It requires you to bring your truest self to the table, to show up, to have a discussion, to stay in the room when it gets uncomfortable, both metaphorically and literally, and be willing to work through these kinks and work through these like different roadblocks that could pop up, or work through these walls that may happen. And I think that in order to know if you can really engage authentically with someone, you have to know if you're willing to show up for those conversations with them, if they're willing to show up as well. And I think all of that should be a ground basis in how we figure out who we're playing with and how we're playing with them and how we're engaging.
And how would you know exactly if you or your partner is ready to show up for that conversation? Do you just ask, or is there like a process that you can form to decide whether or not this is a good time to have this conversation, especially when it is one of those harder conversations?
I mean, I definitely just ask. I've sort of learned a gentle way to ask very difficult questions to specific people in my life when I know that it's difficult for them. But I also know concerning play that I have a lot of good friends that, you know, have different questionnaires that they have people fill out before they play with them, which can seem incredibly formal, but their questionnaires are super in depth about things that they may or may not be comfortable with. And it ultimately leads as a catalyst to having a wider conversation about the things that might be possible as they play. I think that's super enriching and amazing. I also just sort of like to have conversations with people. I specifically like to have chats before we play and sort of just see the natural flow in which our conversation goes and what they're willing to open up about, what they're not willing to open up about. And that also leads me to, you know, asking people about when they've hurt other people, because that tells me a lot, just like understanding different answers to certain questions and it really shedding light on how people's thought processes go, and also just understanding that you're not necessarily judging that person or connecting any of their actions to their morality. And like something that I do is just asking people, you know, like what has happened in the past when you've had like a consent violation, or what has happened in the past when you might have injured someone, because I highly believe in this world. It's not about if you hurt someone, it's when you do this long enough, things are going to happen. And it's whether you hurt someone emotionally, whether you hurt someone physically. And if you're not aware of any times that has happened, then it probably just means that the conversation hasn't been open for you to figure that out. Or it worries me about maybe like your extent of experience based on what you might have told me, or it just leads me to understand a little bit more about your experience so far. But I just like to ask people questions and kind of see how it goes. And I also leave the door open to allowing them to ask me questions, and if they're open to that at all, or if they have any questions to ask me as well.
So what sort of questions would you normally look for? Both like what would you want to ask somebody, and what sorts of questions would you hope that somebody would ask you?
I'm just leave the door open to how people like to formulate their words and their own opinions. Not that I'm never really coming up with an expectation of what they should be asking me, but I like to just ask about like the environment in which they like to play, emotionally, and what type of energy they feel like they're bringing to the table. I like to ask about like specifically that day, how they're feeling, how they've been, like about anything as simple and tangible as like their food intake and water intake for the day, to something more esoteric about like their emotions for the day, what type of things they're processing, how they're feeling in the space that we're going to be playing in. And then I also like to pick apart just different things and throwing out different ideas of things that I like to do in terms of kink, just to see how open they are about talking about them versus doing them, and just opening up the door to discussing the experience that they've had with certain kinks. But I definitely start with building the environment of understanding, like, is this going to be more playful? Is it going to be more, you know, primal? Is it going to be more silly? You know, or is this going to be a labbing experience? Are we looking to come out of this with any type of education and learning? Or, you know, like what are there certain expectations that you're coming to the table with that I should be aware of? And really understanding that person, their perspective of where they're coming from, and therefore having a deeper understanding of how they might engage and play with me.
When you are going through the process of asking questions and having these conversations, how important do you think it is for disclosure of certain things? So one of the conversations that I've been having a lot recently in my local community is disclosure of physical and mental health status, and like how in depth I'm using air quotes here for people who can't see, which is everyone, you know, how much you should disclose before you get into these deeper relationships with people, before you have these connections. Are you someone who thinks that it's important to be super upfront about like the conditions that you might be dealing with, or do you think that's up to more the individual situation, or just whatever you happen to be comfortable with in your relationship with that person?
Yeah, I think that's a personal decision. I would hope that, you know, in a utopian world, I would hope that, you know, people could feel free of judgment and feel as if they could disclose whatever they want to someone when they're playing with them. But I also know that that's not always reality. And that I think that if you you should feel comfortable enough with a person to be able to disclose how you're feeling on that specific day, whether that means you disclose anything you might be struggling with long term, or like you were referring to before, any specific like mental health diagnosis or anything that you might be carrying with you. Whether that means you're disclosing that or not, I think you should at least at a base rate feel comfortable to disclose how you are realistically feeling in that day and how that might affect your play. Because I do think that that is also, you know, like having that, giving that person the allowance of like having consent of engaging with you when you're feeling a specific way, whether that's feeling incredibly happy and upbeat, or whether that's feeling like a little bit manic, but also like understanding how that might affect your play, whether you're feeling a little bit sad, so you would prefer to not have a specific type of play. But all of these things are rooted in you knowing yourself. A lot of us, it's hard for us to answer these questions if we haven't checked in with ourselves. And if we don't, you know, keep that consistent check-in with ourselves after we play of knowing like, you know, when I'm feeling really emotionally fragile, which in my opinion has nothing to do with any type of mental health status, because that's something that we all go through, you know, it affects the way that I like impact play. It affects how much, you know, I can take in terms of pain. It affects what type of pain I want to feel. It might mean that I might start crying, but crying doesn't necessarily mean that we need to end the scene. Just, you know, being able to verbalize these certain things to your partner so that it makes for a more conducive scene for both of you. But also understanding that you might feel safe enough, and hopefully feel safe enough with that person, that if something unexpected happens, that you won't feel completely blindsided, or they won't feel blindsided about what happens emotionally in scenes. And a lot of this I'm referring to emotions because that's what I see happens a lot of the time. I mean, there are definite people who are just physical fucking predators. Like those people definitely exist. But I find that what I'm hearing about a lot in my community is people like, you know, getting emotionally hurt by other people carrying a lot of emotional baggage and emotional pain based on how they're engaging with other people in play. And so I think all of this is still deeply rooted in how we are having a relationship and intimacy with ourselves and with our own processes.
And I think going off of that, I think that is a really important point to bring up, is a lot of this is very emotional. And I think that's a lot of the reasons why we're having difficulty having these conversations in our community. Is it's very clear cut when it's like, oh, so he stabbed me. He didn't have permission to do that. Like, that's a very like, oh, okay, that's a clear boundary violation. You don't do that sort of thing to another human, especially without them explicitly asking for it. But when it comes to those more emotional situations, when maybe one person is having their own individual experience, and then the other person is perceiving it in a totally different way with their own emotional experience, that becomes a lot more difficult to navigate. Do you have any insight into how maybe we could start having those sorts of conversations when it does come to situations when, I guess I usually call a consent oopsie, when it's not necessarily an egregious boundary violation, but people left the situation feeling hurt, feeling like things did not go as they expected, feeling like they basically didn't have their autonomy respected by the person that they were interacting with. Do you have any insight there?
Yeah, I mean, this is also something that I personally, and I'll start with going off of my personal practice, that I really like to do, especially with new people that I tie with or engage in any type of scene or kink play with, is just like I have a personal check-in with myself, and then I have a personal check-in or negotiation with the person. I also like to follow up with that person. And before we even engage in any type play, I get their consent about following up with my process and how I feel afterwards. That sometimes it does take me a couple of days to process. So we might, you know, sit down after the scene and chat, but I might have more thoughts and feelings after a couple of days that we've played. And if they're open to having that type of discussion with me, and I like to also, especially if there's something that I specifically want to talk to them about that they might not view as positively, I like to then once again get their consent about asking if they're willing to show up and engage in like a decompression conversation with me. And I'm always sure to be careful about how I bring that to them. One, because I want to respect my own feelings and make sure that they're actually heard. And people tend to not hear you when they feel like they're being accused. But at the same time, I like to extend compassion to that person while also knowing that it's not necessarily my job to coddle their feelings around, you know, my process. But the type of person that I choose to show up to be is to bring my issues or my issue with a feeling up to them with compassion, just because I find that works better in terms of long-term outcome. But if I feel like I can't, I also, offer any type of consent saying that, like I do have a close community, a close, circle that I do like to decompress and discuss my feelings with. And would they be willing to hear my feelings from them if I don't feel like I can engage with them, or if there's a specific way that they would like to talk, because I do like to talk to people directly. I like to talk to them over Skype or like see their face or talk to them on the phone. But if they don't feel, and I've had numerous people not feel comfortable with that, just maybe out of like shame or guilt. So I engage with them over email or some way of writing it down. But I just like to find a solution that has the most workability in terms of working for everyone in the situation, including myself, my safety, and my feelings. But I do like to make that person aware that like I wasn't necessarily comfortable with this feeling. Do I think that's your fault? Yes or no? Which usually the answer is no, because part of my own process is understanding that like people don't set out to hurt me. Sometimes they just hurt me as a result of lack of conversation, lack of awareness. Do I blame this person? What do I need to do to keep myself safe as a result of this happening to me? And just making that person aware of it. And if I can't make them aware of it for some sort of personal reason, then, making them aware that I'm not making it aware to them or like that I don't intend on talking to them about it.
And I think this whole concept of a decompression conversation is, I think, really important, at least from what I've observed again in my local community. There can sometimes be an avoidance of difficult conversations when it comes to a scene maybe not going perfectly, or there being some kind of awkwardness, or maybe like 98% of it was great and there was just like, hey, so you use this like one word and I'm not like a fan of this specific language for myself, and just whatever it happens to be, to whatever degree. I think sometimes people feel very reluctant to start having these conversations because it can come across like you're blaming somebody else for your feelings, or you're trying to tell someone you did everything wrong, or this is your fault and I didn't do anything wrong, you're the bad guy. And I think if we can start having these conversations, because they are important to have, in a way where it's not about assigning an apportionment of blame for like, you are responsible for 90% of the reason why this scene went terribly or whatever, thinking about it in terms of like, hey, here's how things went for me, here are my current feelings, and here's what I'm processing. And then just having that dialogue. It doesn't have to be a you were right, or I was right and you were wrong is normally how it goes. Like having those sorts of conversations, I think, is less helpful, less productive long term than being like, hey, I just want to check in with like how you're doing with what happened during our scene, and I'd love the opportunity to share some thoughts with you. And just like having that door open, I think, is a really, really beneficial thing to have. And not only because they are literally beneficial, but I think if you are somebody who is newer and trying to start to find ethical tops, or at least people who are more likely to be able to receive criticism and or feedback, like, do you have a process such as decompression conversations? Do you include a debrief as part of your aftercare? And if they don't, or they don't have any idea what that is, maybe you can introduce the concept to them. Or maybe you might want to decide that like, I don't really necessarily want to play with somebody where there's zero possibility that we're going to be able to talk about how things went afterward.
Exactly. And just knowing if they have that availability to show up for that, because that is a real question to ask. And knowing that whatever answer they have is not really a reflection of whether they're right or wrong, whether they're good or bad, and just maybe if they're right for you to play with or not. But I think that that's also like a huge part of this practice, because I am a firm believer, as someone who meditates, who does have a yoga practice, and I say yoga with like a capital Y, because I mean, it's not just like the body movements and the asana, but really like the sitting down, the meditation, the inward journey and the inward discovery, and really like the study of a lot of like the esoteric philosophies of yoga, and just understanding that like it's teaching us to sit with discomfort, and it's teaching us to go inward even when we don't like what's there. It's teaching us that we're looking in the mirror all the time, and all these other people are just mirrors of who we are, and there's really no separation between the other person and you. That other person is you in another lifetime on a different journey. It's all the same. That really like these little things that we might throw away as something so simple simple throughout the day, a mindfulness ritual, a ritual where we're getting in touch with ourselves, little things like journaling or writing down your thoughts or sharing your thoughts with a dear, like beloved friend. All of those things that we might take for granted or see as throwaway moments throughout the day are really those moments that are harnessing this ability to be able to sit with the uncomfortable thing of maybe hearing something that we might not like so much, or hearing something where it's very easy to create a story that as a result we're a bad person, but really just taking the facts as the facts and then learning that we are able to digest them through our body based on our perception.
Maybe we should have had this conversation a bit earlier on, but let's maybe get into it a little bit now. For people who are not really necessarily yet in tuned with their bodies or their mind, or especially like a mind-body connection. I know you mentioned a couple things that people might have naturally as mindfulness practices, like walking your dog or when you're kind of making your morning cup of coffee. Do you have any suggestions for how you start making that a little bit more of a conscious mindfulness practice? Like something, for example, you could use to help recenter yourself after a scene?
Yeah, I think that honestly, it starts very small, and that starting small helps us not feel like we're failing ourselves when we can't always complete it. Because the reality is we live in the human world. We all have jobs, we all have obligations. Some of us have children, so we all have things that we must tend to throughout the day, and it can be really intimidating to feel like you have to add something else that you should be doing. But really, it's about the ritual of extending the time for ourselves. And so my biggest piece of advice, honestly, is to start and to have something first thing in the morning. It's the easiest thing to dedicate something first thing in the morning to ourselves. And when you do something first thing in the morning for yourself, it allows you to start the day with a win. It allows you to just begin your day and lay out the format of your day with a win for yourself because you showed up for yourself. Whether that means you meditate and breathe for 5 minutes in the morning, whether that means that you wake up 5 minutes earlier than your alarm clock just so you have the time to sit and like write. Something that I do is like morning pages, writing a couple of pages in the morning of just like how I felt when I woke up, if I remembered my dream, what I want for today, all of the things like my intention for the day and the intention I'm trying to place into all of my movements, just little tips and tricks like that. And those little things will start to become resources even after scenes as well, of just like decompressing, writing down your own thoughts, maybe sitting in a space by yourself, maybe be sharing space with that person after you finish a scene, because that's how you like to cultivate those emotions and really get in touch with how you feel. And I think it's different for everyone, but that is something that I will be offering on my Patreon channel, which is launching next week. And I'm very excited. I guess it's this week now because it's Sunday. The week of Labor Day is when my Patreon is launching. And so that is what is really going to be available on there, is just different options and different availabilities for people to get more in touch with themselves and have more intentional and mindful kink.
One of the things I wanted to talk about as well is specifically when it comes to finding connection before a scene. One of the things I know that we brought up during the class at Ropecraft, but that also I've been thinking about a lot, is how you can both negotiate for a scene where it's like, okay, you're going to be the rope top, you're the rope bottom, we're going to do a suspension, we're going to do these transitions, we're going to do XYZ thing, but then the people go into it completely like disconnected from each other and are clearly like not on the same wavelength necessarily. Do you have any insight to offer when it comes to maybe avoiding those situations in the first place, but how you can maybe repair things when you start to notice that a scene is kind of going in that direction and you're kind of feeling like maybe you're disconnecting from your partner?
Yeah, I think as a bottom, and as someone who identifies more as a bottom than a top, really, my first instinct is usually I just ask for what I need, because I don't really have the power mid suspension, usually when I'm bound, to make any like specific movements. Specifically in a labbing situation, I use my voice, and I usually will offer reassuring words and try to hold space for my top, because I realize that the reason that a lot of tops become disconnected in labbing situations is usually over stress from trying to learn something, trying to remember something, trying to make sure that I'm safe. And so reassuring them that I am safe and that I'm okay really helps. But in the middle of like a scene, I like to, first of all, I always tell everyone the type of connection that I like in a scene. I like those moments moments of pause. I like their hands being on me and feeling like I know where they are, even if my eyes are closed. But I also just like those moments of being able to look at them. And so I've definitely, in the middle of a scene, I've noticed that like this person is just transitioning me from one place to another. And I have out of a deep desire to really connect with that person, I've stopped and asked them, like, can you just look at me for a second? And like, or can I see you or something like that? And I've literally said that to somebody in a dungeon and just taken that moment so that I can just like look them in the eye and see them. And it kind of reminds them, because we don't always have to use words. Humans were really good at picking up on those like signs of connection, especially when we're already involved in those moments. But it is easy for us, especially with rope, with something that's so technical and something that is honestly so dangerous, that we are very highly concerned with the safety of everyone involved. And I think the same goes for tops. I think tops have a lot of grounding power in scenes. Bottoms do as well, but I think that tops, just as the person who is in more bodily control of the situation, specifically concerning rope, that there is a lot of grounding power in just being able to touch someone without moving the rope, just touch someone's body and, you know, help them ground themselves, especially if you see them start to breathe really quickly, or you see them start to move in an uncomfortable way because you see that they're leaning into the discomfort in a way that's making them maybe panic or like slide into fight or flight, or just something, just having that moment of looking at them or breathing with them or even getting so close to them that they hear your breath. Our bodies and our nervous systems want to match each other. They want to look for the ground. It's almost like lightning, like it always looks for the ground. Like our bodies and our mindfulness and our sensation, we're always looking for the grounding. We're always looking for the support. And so for someone to just feel supported for a moment, whether they're the top or the bottom in the scene, can really help like bring that home and just remind, usually what I find it is remind the tops to like move a little slower, because usually it's just like quick, 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 or to remind the bottom like you're safe and you can breathe and that you've got yourself and I've got you. So those are the two most common examples that I find that I run across in my personal experience. But I do think that it's about like being the anchor for each other, because once again, it's not an if, it's when. That just happens to all of us. You could have a hugely stressful day and run a sequence or, do engage in play that you regularly engage in, but it could surprise you how your body chooses to interpret that sensation on this day.
Yeah, and that's a really big thing. And I know we've mentioned already when we're having conversations before we get into scenes about like, what did you eat today? How are you feeling overall? When was the last time you had something to drink? All of that can affect how you interpret things in a scene, depending on what headspace you're going into things with, and having somebody who can be there with you to kind of not necessarily completely alter what path you're on, but kind of maybe steer you in a little bit more of a positive direction. That can be very helpful, and I think is maybe one of the unspoken skills that a top can cultivate, especially in rope, for creating those really amazing scenes.
Yeah, and I do think that, feeding your top from the bottom is also a real thing. I think that that's something that I really find a lot of joy in. I love holding space for tops when I'm tying. I love being able to also know that I can ground them and know that, like by them seeing me authentically for how I'm feeling in the moment, and for them like being able to trust me to know that I can use my words if something's wrong, that, I'm processing in my own way, that I'm also connected to them and that I'm in it with them, can also lead them to feel like, they can move slower, they can be more conscious, they can enjoy the moment, they can step back and observe like their work, that they can do, what they need to do to feel really truly present without being incredibly worried, because I've got me and we've got each other.
Actually, that is one thing I would be interested in hearing more about, because, not just being part of the rope world myself, but also, being tangentially involved in the leather community and kind of just the general BDSM world as a whole. There's a lot of concern around topping from the bottom, or being seen as being like a smart ass or trying to tell your top what to do. How do you navigate kind of lifting your top up while bottoming without feeling like, or maybe making your top feel like you're trying to tell them what to do or like what they should experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's honestly in your words. I think it's how you choose to say things. I think it's your tone. I personally, it's something that comes out in me in terms of like service and from like a submissive way. I don't think that that needs to be the experience for everyone, but I do think that for me, it comes out in a more submissive way where I'm trying to really reinforce like positivity for them in some way. But I do think that it's definitely different. Just like being bratty is different than topping from the bottom. I'm never actually talking to them about specific actions. I'm never really, telling them to do something specific unless it's something for my safety, like asking them, to dress a rope line or, just doing something, for my own personal safety. But I am more just reinforcing their own confidence. But I also think that a part of that is on the top to really like, dismiss their ego and understand that that person is in it with them. And that if we have that foundation of understanding, that there isn't that miscommunication of feeling like someone's trying to tell you what to do.
There definitely can be a lot of ego issues with it, but that's like a whole other conversation. It's like the element of ego in BDSM, because there's certainly quite a lot of that. Before we wrap up today, there was one conversation that we sort of started having before we were recording, and that I'm still trying to think of a good way to phrase it, but I'll describe it as emotional self-responsibility in the kink world. Does that sound like a fair explanation?
Yeah.
So I would, just for people who maybe have no idea what I mean when I say that, would you mind kind of talking about your perspective on how, as kinky people, how we choose to react to certain situations, or how we can take responsibility for emotions, and how we choose to engage with certain things that we see in our community?
Yeah, and this was sort of in reference, of course, to like some of the ideas that I have about staying in touch with yourself and keeping yourself safe, as being seen as like blaming a victim or telling people who have gone through or experienced trauma that it's their responsibility to it's their responsibility to stay true to their own safety. And that's something that I definitely stand behind, because that's not something that I'm trying to do to hurt people's feelings or tell them like, you need to buck up or get over your shit. It's really me just trying to, coming from a place and coming from my own experience as like a marginalized woman of color, knowing that like no one was going to save me but myself. And that like, I don't really believe in specific quote unquote safe spaces that I can be in and promise that I'm never going to be triggered, especially as, a POC living in the South today. And so I just like to reinforce and reiterate that like these types of self-saving skills and skills to get to know myself better and regulate myself saved my life. And that they honestly saved my mentality of walking around and navigating the world, not being triggered all the time, but even if I am triggered, knowing how I can process through my own trauma and how I can keep myself safe in spaces. But if we're expecting the community to work together to keep us safe, if we're expecting every space that we walk into to mold to our safety regulations, if we're expecting other people to make our safety a priority all the time, I think that we are entering into a space where we're asking to be disappointed. And that by me sort of offering these skills and different tools that we can have to help regulate ourselves and help ourselves heal, that it does take the centering off of the people who have done all of the harm and really centers us around how can we relieve ourselves from this trauma and hurt? How can we get out from living under this pain that tends to bleed into every single feeling and activity and thing that we end up doing as a result? And of course, I think accountability is incredibly important, and it's paramount, really. But I think the accountability works both ways in terms of holding people who hurt others accountable, as well as, being accountable for ourselves, our own feelings, and our own process to healing.
This is certainly a complex conversation to have, especially because we are kind of getting to be now in a time when we are giving people more space to share their negative experiences and not just like silence them immediately and being like, so and so would never do anything wrong. They've been running this leather event for 20 years. How could they possibly not be a perfect, upstanding, moral citizen? And I think when it comes down to taking responsibility, for yourself, I think it's you have a duty to yourself to be kind to yourself. And then also, as a community, we can kind of meet together in a space where we are taking actions and choosing behaviors that enable people to feel empowered to share their experiences and their stories in an honest way, without at the same time reacting purely out of anger to everything. And that's sort of the main observation I've seen is we get to the anger part, but we don't always necessarily go beyond that into solutions or processing or working through things. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that anger is something that happens. I think anger is something that can be expressed in a healthy way. I think that very often we allow it to stunt us from actually seeing everything the way that it is. And we allow the anger to write a story for us of what has happened. And then we start to live out that story. And so I just think that it takes a good mindful process of like sharing, because once again, I think that transformation is conversational. So like having these conversations is important. I think that having conversations about your pain, about your hurt, about your trauma, about your experience is important. And I also think that the other person having a conversation about their experience is important. It might not be around you because you're the person that they traumatize. You don't deserve to have to sit in the room with someone and have to hear their perspective of any bullshit if you don't want to. It's really like, this is a personal decision, but I do think that it's very easy to dehumanize people when we shut them up and when we cancel them and when we tell them to stop talking and we cancel them and we ignore them. It's very easy to dehumanize them and just accept the fact that they did it because they're just a horrible person and that's the end of it. We should throw them away. And I think that having conversations where we allow people to arrive knowing that we're two people who have experienced trauma or maybe hurt people, or all I'm trying to say with bringing this to the table is the fact that there are predators out there, but every person who hurts someone else is not a fucking predator. Is not like a mindful predator. I think that consent violations and trauma exist on a spectrum, not that there is a comparative trauma or we don't need to have like the trauma Olympics of who is hurt more, because that's all a perception of how we interpret things through our own life and through our own body and experience. But I do think that there is a spectrum that exists here. And that understanding the intention and understanding how these actions came to be, and if it was straight up mindfulness, if it was malice, if it was, what have you, and if this is a pattern in their behavior, will help us understand what kind of accountability needs to be shed on them and what kind of work needs to be done. But understanding that like, shutting them out is leading a lot of these people to believe that they're in charge of their own accountability process and that they get to decide when they come back in to a community with people that they've hurt. And that's something that I also don't believe is true. I think that order to be held accountable, like that is sort of and this is, coming from someone who's like native and understands like the tribal aspect of community, but like a part of centering the people who are in this situation, both the person that is hurt and the accuser, is understanding that like the community are the people that decide when this is okay and when you've done enough work. The community, especially the people that you've hurt, are some of the people that get to help decide that. But when we cancel them and when we decide to ignore them, then they are left to believe that they get to decide, well, I've done this class and I talked to this one person, so I think I'm allowed to start teaching again. And it's hard to come out of the woodworks when you've been canceling a person for 2 years and then all of a sudden try to decide what type of person that they are. And canceling people forever is really harmful, because it's just, you never really get to know if they're being held accountable or not. And it also just, whenever someone hurts anyone, it also leads people to not want to speak up about it, to not want to have a process about it, because they're worried they're going to be canceled. And this is speaking from someone who already feels canceled. I mean, I'm someone who every time I express, exactly 40 weeks ago when I reposted something else from another person who was not a person of color and ended up getting deleted over it. It's like I express my view and people have a feeling about it and their feeling is anger. So I'm canceled and I'm a bad person and I'm a bad leader and like, how dare I? And exactly 40 weeks later, the same thing happened where I reposted something that wasn't even written by the person that people are so angry about and that I also got from from another person's page who is a friend of mine, who is not a person of color, and who received very little to no backlash right away. But I was immediately, a bad person. And my point was immediately not seen and not cared about, because how dare I? And I am a bad leader. And I am, like, as a woman of color, I am immediately canceled all the time. My opinions, my view comes secondary to other people's feelings. And that is problematic to me, no matter who you think a person is.
This is all such a complex situation that we're all not having to figure out as a community how we deal with things in a way we've never really had to consciously address before. And it's like we're sort of stumbling through trying to figure out what to do. And because, like, for that exact reason that you talked about with, if we are not more or less keeping tabs on somebody because they've been completely ostracized and are no longer interacting with anybody in the community in any capacity, they get to kind of decide when they feel like they should come back. And I think this is the big flaw in our system, for lack of a better term, we have right now is in my community. I've seen this in other places. I've seen this where somebody will get banned from every single venue, in a 100-mile radius. And I'm not saying that's a bad decision. Nobody who's part of those communities is keeping up with them in an ongoing process. And then, like, 6 months later, they open up their own dungeon or they get their own munch. And we don't really have a great solution for that, because it's not like you can't call the local Olive Garden and be like, hey, don't let this person have group meetings at your Olive Garden, for very complex and kink specific reasons. There's not really a good way to work around that, because having conversations about transformative accountability, these are really complex and things that we don't really have experience doing this. We don't really have experience with actually being able to work through these processes. And I'm sure, I have confidence that eventually we'll figure out how to deal with all of these things in a healthy way where everybody feels like they are getting their needs met.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's important to remember it's complex and it's also different every time it happens. And I think it needs to be treated as such. There is no, we can try to create some sort of outline for a protocol, but there really is no protocol that's going to work consistently across the board. And that people have to be willing to show up. And it's a lot of emotional work. It's a lot of emotional labor. But I think that we have to be willing to show up for both the good and the bad in order to engage authentically with our community and bring us to a safer and more conducive space for all of us.
Mm-hmm. And in your situation where it's something where, it's a repost of something that somebody said that has been, I'm not familiar with this person specifically enough to say, but I believe it was a situation where that person had been banned or at least had known consent allegations against them that were out in the open. How do we handle that sort of situation? Because I don't necessarily agree that air quote canceling somebody for just reposting a repost of that is a good thing to do. I think it can come from a good place of being hey, are you aware that this person has these issues that have been brought to light? Are you sure you want to associate with that person or be promoting their words? More or less, as I believe how people seem to be interpreting it as you're endorsing what they say, and that means you're endorsing them as a person. Has that been your experience in the situation?
I think that's really it, is that if you share space with this person, if you still follow them on Instagram, if you ever like any of their pictures, if we see you talking to them at an event, if you are associated with this person in any way, you are automatically vouching for that person. You are automatically aligning yourself with that person and saying that you agree with them and agree with, their stance and their view, and you're giving them a platform. And I kind of think that all of that is bullshit. I mean, I do understand that, first of all, something that I posted was not even this person's words, but, and I have been witness to some of what I would consider from my own personal perspective to be kind of verbal harm that this person has expressed. So I although I do not know the experiences personally of the people that they hurt, directly and physically, I have definitely witnessed variations of this person's personality that I am not a huge fan of. None of that was the point of why I made that post. I made that post because for out of a very slim time in this community, I see that women of color are being spoken about, especially by non-women of color, and that I saw a quote that resonated with my personal experience that I found to be true. So I posted it. That being ignored is already like the profound irony of the entire situation, that it's like, fuck your perspective. My feelings matter more because I hate this person. Also, the fact that, God, if I really, I mean, I don't know, I just don't live that way. I totally respect that people think that, that person should never be heard from again. But I mean, frankly, fuck, I live in a country where someone is the president who probably doesn't give a shit about my life. So, and talks about it every day without any type of, hesitance. So I understand where people are coming from. I don't consider reposting a quote that's not written by that person that happened to be from their story, giving this person a platform. I also don't think that if you ever see anybody on my social media that you might not agree with, that you should think that I'm vouching for that person. I think that once again, this goes back into having authentic community conversations, and that if people want to know what I think about a person, or if I think they should tie with them, or if I think that person is safe, that they should ask me. And if they ask me directly, I'm going to tell them, and I'm going to give them a real authentic answer about my experiences with that person, maybe some experiences that I might know of with that person. And I'm going to be authentic on whether or not I vet them or not. I have pictures that exist online with people that I wouldn't vet, to new people who in rope. I engage with people, or maybe even follow some people who I specifically am following to watch their accountability process, but don't necessarily agree with them. And I don't make it a habit to engage with them on social media all the time. But if somebody new were to go onto my FetLife, which I haven't logged into for, 6 freaking months, or, go onto any of my social media and just say, well, Shakti Bliss is friends with this person or follows this person, or 6 months ago, they commented on one of Shakti Bliss's photos, they're friends with them, then this must be okay. I think that's an assumption that is very dangerous. And that if you want to have an authentic conversation with somebody, or you want to know someone's opinion on someone, you should just ask.
That's an important thing to keep in mind. Like, I personally hate that, like, on social media, everything is like, oh, they're followers, they're your friends, they're your whatever, because it implies a very specific type of connection to the people that you associate on social media in that regard. And I think, especially in the rope community, when you're constantly having to, like, reevaluate like half of the community on like a yearly basis in terms of like, are they still like, have they had any recent consent accusations? Have they gone through the classes for like basic consent they were supposed to do? Like, I think there are a lot of situations, speaking as a content creator myself, where I might air quote follow somebody, but it's not because I endorse their opinions or believe that they're a good person. It's like, I just want to keep track of what this person has been up to. So if somebody does come to me and they do have questions about like, hey, what do you think about XYZ person? I can give them an honest opinion based on what I've seen that they've been doing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's very complex, and I would encourage people to think about things from a nuanced way, and not just assume that because, oh, you're following this person, that means you're best friends with them, or you agree with everything that they say, because it's entirely possible that, like, especially when you are in a position when you're expected to be really up to date with like everything that's going on in the community, that might mean sometimes you follow people that are maybe not somebody that you agree with, or somebody that you would be friends with or encourage people to play with. And I guess there is a perspective of that's that kind of passive engagement is passive endorsement, and there might be somebody who's going through the list of people you follow to find people they should follow, and that can also be something to consider as well. And again, it's, these are all very new things. There's things we haven't really had to think about before. It wasn't like we had Instagram 20 years ago. Nobody had to think that complexly about what does it mean when I follow somebody on Twitter.
Exactly. It all goes into Instagram etiquette, which is evolving every day and is very different for the kink community than it is for a lot of other communities that exist over Instagram or any other social media platform. And I do think that also extends to people who are survivors of trauma, because it's really, we're talking about, oh, it's your responsibility to keep yourself safe, and that includes on the internet. If it means that, seeing someone's name makes you feel unsafe, then I think that's valid. And I think you have to curate your space as best you can while you're processing that trauma. And I also believe that, it's something to hopefully process and get to the other side of, not because that other person deserves your acceptance, but because you deserve freedom from the trauma that you might have to digest as a result of just seeing someone's name. And I can definitely relate to that as somebody who, it sounds silly to some people, especially here in the South, but it relates to me in a political way. And seeing Trump's name is triggering to me. It is triggering. And especially after he won the presidency, it is triggering to me. But I mean, as somebody who also lives in the South and who lives in America, that was something that I had to learn to process. And I work on every day to free myself from, not because that person deserves my acceptance, but because I deserve the freedom of not having to curate everything to where I don't see that, because I have to stay aware. I have to stay involved in what's going on. I choose not to ostrich myself and stick my head in the sand. And I don't have a choice but to be aware of where we are and where we stand. And so I do completely think that it's valid to take care of your pain. But I also think that eventually we have to learn to digest the pain and free yourself from it, because I want that freedom for everyone.
I really agree with the idea of curating your own space, especially when you're dealing with something that's really raw and new. You don't have to choose to engage with anybody you don't want to engage in. I am a very liberal believer in the block button or muting on Twitter or whatever it is that you need to do to help you have a space to process things. Do that for yourself, and hopefully you can get to a place where maybe that doesn't need to be on the block list anymore, but it's not up to me or anybody else to decide how long that takes to get to that space. And if you don't want to engage with somebody, you don't have to, but it's about knowing kind of what you need and being honest with yourself for what that is, and also being accepting of the fact that other people might not be in that same space, and other people might have different reasons or priorities for choosing to engage or not engage with something.
Yes. And I definitely think that, curating your space is one thing, but the reason why I say free yourself from the pain is not so that you can eventually let's just say follow that person again on Instagram, but because it's outside of your ability to curate every space that you might ever enter ever in your life again, unless we want to run the risk of, always having to bring up this person who traumatized you to make sure that their name might not be on something, that someone who you follow on Instagram might not repost them, that they might not show up in a program, that they might not show up in whatever, to really take care of yourself by healing your pain. And maybe you never engage with them again because that's your right. But just understanding that it is an impossibility to curate every space that you might enter again, unless you want to shut yourself out. And I don't think that canceling yourself is the answer either.
Yeah, that's also very true as well. You have to be careful, because one of the best things we have about this community is it's a great place for social connection. It's a great way to build a support network, build a place where you can, be your authentic self around other people. And it would be really unfortunate if somebody felt like they couldn't access that anymore because of something else that was going on in their lives. And I that's for me, that's one of the most painful things, is to see people feel like they're not allowed to be in a certain space anymore because of something that they've been processing, and feeling like they can't rely on the people who are supposed to be there for them as fellow community members.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I think we have spent quite a long time talking now. Was there anything else you wanted to bring up before we wrap up today?
There's nothing specific, but I do just want to leave out there to everyone who is listening to this and that engages in the community, to just understand that all I wish for you is for you to know your own personal power and your own ability to impact people in such a profound way. You decide if that profound way is positive or negative. And I hope to see you without judgment. I hope you see me without judgment. And my goal here in this community is really just to reinforce everyone's personal power and allow us to harness it in a really, really respectful and impactful way.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and opinions today. If people do have their own questions, anything else, you can leave that down in the comment section below on this video on YouTube. Is there anywhere else where people could reach out to you if they have further questions they'd like to go over with you?
Yeah, you can reach out to me at Shakti Bliss Bunny. I am on Instagram with that name. That's also my Gmail email address. And you can also find me after Labor Day on Patreon at Shakti Bliss Bunny.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being here and for sharing your thoughts. This was a wonderful conversation. If people want to, there will be links down in the description box so they can check out your Patreon and other social media if they want to follow you on there. If you guys like this specifically and you haven't already, please do subscribe to this channel. I make videos twice a week around all sorts of different BDSM things. Sometimes we do interviews like this, or one-on-one videos, or tutorials or toy reviews, a bunch of different things. So if you haven't already, please do subscribe. And until I see you guys next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.